Hey everyone, it's Dr. Hall. We're going to start talking about the brain. And the first part of the brain that we're going to talk about are some of the structures that we find exteriorly, because that's going to help us in lab, because those are the first things we're going to run into. So we're starting with that part, even though the textbook actually starts with some of the more interior structures of the brain. So I've broken lecture 4 into two parts. So in 4A, we're going to talk about the meninges, the ventricles, and the CSF. So here's that outline. In 4B, we're going to talk about blood vessels, arteries, capillaries, and veins, and kind of put everything together. The meninges are coverings of both the brain and the spinal cord. We're focusing on the brain right now, but we're going to find them again when we get to the spinal cord. And these are protective membranes. Their job is to help protect this squishy jelly-like mass that is our brain. And so they kind of act a little bit like bubble wrap or a little bit like a container to help protect the brain and the spinal cord, because those are pretty important parts of our body. In this diagram here, let me point out, we're going to see a layer here that's kind of in gray. There's two parts of it, another layer here, and then a fine layer here. That's clear as mud. This one's a little bit better. Okay, so there are 3 layers of the meninges. So in this particular diagram, we've got the scalp or the skin right here. This big green thing is the skull. Now, the first meningeal layer we're going to find is this orange one here, which is called the dura mater. In Latin, it literally translates to tough mother, right? So like the word durable comes from the same Latin root. And so this is a very thick, fibrous layer. When you see it in lab, it's pretty remarkable how tough this is. And it's attached to the inside of the skull and helps kind of seal off the brain there. So the dura mater is the outermost one. It's the thickest one. It's very tough. Then right below that, we have the arachnoid mater, and that is very web-like. And so that's where the name comes from. Arachnoid is in like spider web, and it has all these little webby kind of projections. And you can see that there's kind of a space there in between those little things. And that space is going to be filled with some fluid that we're going to talk about soon. And then our final membrane is this red one here, which is the pia mater. Now, the pia mater is attached directly to the surface of the brain. So if you remember from anatomy and physiology, when we talked about, for example, the visceral pleura is directly adherent to the surface of the lungs, the visceral pericardium, the visceral peritoneum, right? This is the same principle. It's like the visceral meninge. So the pia mater directly attaches to the brain. So there are spaces, and I put that in quotes, between these layers because most of the time there's not actually space there. Most of the time it's either sealed or there's something else in it, or the things are together. But so a potential space, think of it like the space between your fitted sheet and your top sheet. When your bed is made and you're not in it, there's actually no space, but it's a potential space because you can put your feet, you can put your body in there in between those sheets. So when we talk about potential spaces in anatomy, these are examples of potential spaces. So the first one I want to point out to you is the epidural space. So the epidural space is here. Epi, remember, as a prefix, usually means kind of above or just outside of. So it is epidural. It is above the dura mater. So it's in that potential space between the dura mater and the inside of the skull. Now, as I told you, they're actually attached. So usually there's actually nothing in that space. It's just a potential space. But if you've ever heard of an epidural, right, used for analgesia in labor, then you're like, wait a minute. So yeah, when we talk about the spinal cord, we'll talk about epidural anesthesia. Next, we have the subdural space. So the subdural space is right here, and that is between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. So remember, arachnoid mater is that webby one, and so there is a potential space in between those two layers there. And then our third and final, I'm going to change my color, is the subarachnoid space, which is this whole space here. Now, this one is a little different in that this usually is a space. It's usually filled with fluid, as well as those webby extensions of the arachnoid mater. So the main body of the main part of the membrane for the arachnoid mater is right here, adherent to the underside of the dura mater, and then you have these webby extensions that come down to the pia mater. So those are the three spaces. The subarachnoid space usually has CSF in it, but the other two spaces are usually just potential spaces. They're usually not actual spaces at all, assuming everything is working normally. A little bit of like foreshadowing there. Okay, so those are the meninges and the spaces. Now we're going to talk about ventricles and CSF. So CSF stands for cerebrospinal fluid, so brain and spinal cord fluid, and it is the fluid that is found in the CNS and its spaces. So you may remember from when we talked about ependymal or ependymal cells, you can pronounce it either way. Those are one of the glia that we talked about, that they produce and circulate CSF. So they do it in special regions of the brain called the choroid plexus. These are special structures where these ependymal cells are closely related with some special capillaries, and they take some fluid from the bloodstream and they put it out into these spaces in the brain as CSF. So cerebrospinal fluid is really interesting because it has a pretty high sodium concentration. So it's kind of hyperosmolar, right? So it's got a high concentration of sodium in it. So it helps to kind of float the brain. So, oh, I went out of order. I'm going to go back. So the first thing it does is it cushions the brain. So we have CSF in that subarachnoid space, and it's like a little water cushion all around the inside of your skull, which is really helpful if you want to like shake your head around. I'm not going to be banging my brain against the inside of the skull and causing bruising. Okay, now that's rather distracting, so I'm going to get rid of Beavis and Butthead. All right, so it also helps to float the brain. So here's that part about the high sodium concentration. This is a picture of a woman in the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is known for having very high salt concentration, and so you can just easily float in it like crazy. So CSF does a similar thing for the brain. The brain is relatively delicate and it's pretty big and heavy. So if we didn't have cerebrospinal fluid to help float it, it would kind of smush itself under its own weight. The last thing about the CSF is it also kind of circulates and percolates through the brain and spinal cord and helps to move waste materials out of the brain. So you've got this image here of, kind of rinsing a bunch of berries. So think of like the CSF is kind of percolating between the neurons of the brain and kind of washing out any waste materials that accumulate. So that's CSF. So CSF is located both outside of the brain in that subarachnoid space that we talked about. Let me get the highlighter. I think that shows up a little bit better. So cerebrospinal fluid here in this subarachnoid space where the webby stuff is. But it's also found within the brain in structures called ventricles, aqueducts, and canals. And so you can kind of see some of that structure here. Let's take a closer look. This is from the Hedges textbook. So we're going to find inside each cerebral hemisphere, inside each half of the cerebrum, we are going to find the lateral ventricles. And so here is a side view. You can see the lateral ventricles are pretty extensive. Here it is from an anterior view. They really kind of hook out into the brain quite a bit. Then the fluid can move through a little tiny opening called the interventricular foramen. Remember, the word foramen means hole, into the third ventricle. Now, there's just one third ventricle. It's right here in the center of the brain, right here. And it's just in the space between the thalami. So there's a single third ventricle. From there, it can move through a little skinny tube called the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle, I always think of it as kind of just right before and in front of the cerebellum. And then from there, the cerebral spinal fluid can move down into the central canal. Oops, my aim is not very good. And the central canal moves down through the center of the spinal cord. So we have CSF in these ventricles within the brain and also in the central canal in the inside of the spinal cord. The choroid plexus is a specialized structure where the CSF is produced. So you might remember I talked about the ependymal cells, and they have these special regions called the choroid plexus, and where they're in close association with specialized capillaries so that they can make CSF. So those choroid plexi are found in the ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. So you can kind of see those pointed out here. And so that's where the CSF is born, basically. And then it's going to circulate. So remember, we had those cilia on the ependymal cells that are like, and they're moving the CSF around. So the CSF is going to move through all these ventricles, down through the central canal, and then it comes back up through the subarachnoid space and moves all around here. Right? So the CSF is constantly circulating around the inside and through some of the brain tissue, actually, and then also around the outside of the brain and spinal cord as well. So part one in summary, our meninges, we have the dura mater, tough outer layer, arachnoid mater, webby middle layer that has CSF in it, and then the pia mater, which is directly adherent to the surface of the brain. The epidural space is between the dura mater and the skull. Sorry, I left it off of here. Subdural is between dura mater and arachnoid mater, and then subarachnoid is between arachnoid mater and pia mater. And then the CSF, which is made by the ependymal cells in the choroid plexus, which is a specialized structure found in the ventricles. CSF is going to cushion, float, and help clean out the brain by circulating through and removing waste materials. And then it circulates through all of those structures that we talked about, the lateral, third, fourth ventricle, the aqueduct, and the central canal, and then of course the subarachnoid space. So that's it for 4A. Sorry that says 1A. This is 4A. I'll see you for 4B.